Ooh, it worked. That's what's up. I bet. Let's go to the React website real quick. All right, y'all. Okay, cool. So talking about a couple different things here. So last class or last session, really, we started talking about packages and like just the importance of node-based packages in general, and talked a little bit about NPM and like the node package manager in general, and like how basically due to kind of the growth of like the JavaScript open source community, there's a lot of different packages that have been created by other JavaScript developers that you can leverage into your JavaScript projects using the Node Package Manager. The Node Package Manager is a tool that comes installed with Node, and we use Node to run our JavaScript code, which we installed Node right at the very beginning of running our JavaScript stuff. We started using Node. We also talked about, in relationship to this conversation about Node, how inside of like a React app, for instance, you don't even have to worry about these files. Let me just close them real quick. Inside of a React project, for instance, right, or a JavaScript project in general, any project that's leveraging JavaScript is probably going to use Node as a runtime environment to run the code. And you can tell a Node project because of this file, the package.json. Package.json is a file that gets created in Node-based projects as like a, it's a file that defines some metadata for your project, including project name, version, but also more importantly, the dependencies that you're leveraging, any scripts that you want to run related to your code. And with the Create React App toolchain, a lot of this, the package.json gets written for us. It creates some scripts for us. We can add our own scripts in here and give it a key and whatever the kind of command line script you want it to run is. So if I wanted to make a new script for myself, you know what I'm saying, maybe called sample, I could write a new script and maybe give it a command to run on the command line, like, you know what I'm saying, like, I guess, something like that, right? So the package.json is a very important file for node-based projects, and the overall kind of importance of using Node in general is because it allows us to run our JavaScript. But when we were talking about NPM, there's packages for all types of stuff, right? And so one of the things that we were talking about last class was routing, which routing comes from the word route. The word route is referring to navigation and like going on a path and seeing something at a particular path, right? And routing is a very important concept in web development because we use routing to show information based on different paths. And in the React environment, we use routing very specifically to create a navigation system for our React applications. And Create React App toolchain creates a single page application, which basically means that we render one component at the time. We render really one component, and that component is typically rendering other components. But our app.js is like that component that we render in the JavaScript, and that component then is responsible for showing some code, right? So our app.js is the component that we render normally from the index.js. And that component then has like a number of other components normally that it's returning inside of it, right? And but what happens when we want to show different components based on different paths? Maybe we're going on pages and we want to have this idea of like one page shows this component and another page shows that component. Well, that's where this idea of routing comes in. In general, like in a full stack environment, routing could really mean stuff happening on the server and the server returning specific pages. But in the front end sense, especially with React, what we're talking about with routing is the process of telling React what is going on with regards to what component is it supposed to show at different moments in time. So hopefully this is still running and we can see this example. It is. So here we see an example of a page that has like a kind of default component rendering called home. That home page, if I went to the login page, like click this login button, it takes me to a different route. And that route has a different component kind of rendered that it shows, right? And then I was showing y'all this example of essentially having like this kind of dummy login flow that like creates this flow to another component called dashboard. And you can see these routes are changing with the path here at the top. So if I go back to the slash, I'm going straight to the home. If I go to login, I go to the login. If I go to the dashboard, I don't know if it's going to work with a lowercase d. Oh, it is. I'll go to the dashboard. So that is what routing allows us to do, right? Is this process of based on certain URLs, see certain information. That is what routing does in general. But in the React-based sense, we have to use routing to specify what components are getting rendered at the front end in that front end experience. And that's why that just all of the logic that goes behind that is pretty sophisticated. So rather than do all of it ourselves, we can rely on packages that were defined by other React developers and other JavaScript engineers that have extensively taken best practices for dealing with these kinds of situations and creating packages that make it easier for us to work with those things. So the React Router DOM library is a package that has the necessary kind of information we need to create a router in our React-based environments and use that router to do what we just saw, right? Handle the process of us moving from page to page, handle the route changing, and handle the component showing something different. So that's what the React Router DOM package is doing for us. But like any package, this specific one has a profile on the NPM website that we can make use of to install in our own projects. And that's where this whole connection between Node, NPM, and all of these open source kind of projects come back in full circle. And so we use the NPM command to install packages in our local environment. Those packages get added to our package.json, right, which has a list of all the dependencies that we install. So every time you run the command npm install with a name of a package, that package gets added here. So we can see that already there's a lot of packages in here. And that's because when we first run the create React app toolchain, it automatically installs certain packages for us that are necessary for us to use React, but also we can install some of on our own, like the React Router DOM package, which we installed ourselves. Installing that package, then each package has like a GitHub repository of code that is then installed and allows us to get the code added into our project. All of that code gets added into our node modules directory. That node modules directory is the really important directory of all of the kind of dependencies and packages that we've installed. And it can become pretty large, which is why inside of like our git ignore file, for instance, we end up basically ignoring it from Git, because to keep track of this big folder could make your project very sizable. And in fact, when you kind of feel like your computer's running out of space, a good tip, especially if you're doing a lot of JavaScript projects, is to just go through and just delete your node modules folder, because you can always reinstall it, right? But whenever you run the command npm install, when you run the command npm install, that command goes through all of these dependencies and reinstalls them into a new node modules folder. So this folder is safe to delete so long as you have your package.json file. That means you can always reinstall it. And that's why when we do GitHub collaborations, right, a lot of y'all were asking like, well, hey, I just pulled my partner's code and I started trying to run it, but it wasn't working. Like, what's good? And the reality is that the reason it wasn't working was because there were certain startup packages, and like you can see here, like when you do npm start, it's expecting that there's a package called React scripts that's available. But if you don't run npm install before any of that, you don't ever get the React scripts package installed. So you can't actually run the project the way that you would expect to. And that's why you always have to run npm install if you're downloading someone else's code, because it's typically ignored. So you don't have those modules by default. And then if you just got the bare bones project, these dependencies aren't fully installed yet, which means that you can't actually do the things that you're intending to do. So that's just kind of a side note as to why we have to do that npm install each time we start a new project here. Cool. So we talked a lot about the React Router DOM package and started leveraging it, right? And the React Router DOM package has its own homepage and its own website. I think that, I don't know if this web is going to go to the right website. I want to go to. Okay, no, but it has the link right here. So the website is reactrouter.com. And then as you can see here, the version 6 just got released. And so we talked a little bit about the difference. We saw firsthand the differences between V5 and V6 are pretty drastic, meaning that you can't use V5 code and expect it to work anymore. So you have to make sure that you're going through the tutorial for V6. And and it's pretty straightforward from there. They have a pretty interesting tutorial that focuses on this idea of invoices and bookkeeping. So it's like kind of a practical application to go through. But the main concepts themselves are pretty simple to understand, and they kind of list them out up here. How to configure routes, navigating, creating links, and using nested routes, navigating programmatically, and all of these things. And so we used a couple of these in our own kind of example that I showed y'all here, where we had this kind of home component that then we changed to a login component. And then from this login component, after typing in something, right, pressing this submit button programmatically navigates us to this dashboard component. So that's just kind of a typical UX that you can expect to build as a web dev, right? Is I have one page, I need somebody to log in. Maybe at that login page, the only thing that's missing here is after you submit, you're going to want to verify these credentials in a server somehow. And then if the server authenticates it properly, then you might be able to navigate, right? So this is just still a dummy project, but nonetheless, you can imagine how the UX itself is pretty straightforward in terms of how it would be related to a real project or a real application or something. So just diving back into that code real quick, because I just want to just give a quick little recap to that, since the YouTube gods blessed me with the ability to live stream today. But then secondly, I'm going to kind of dive into something very specific that we ended up doing in the programmatic navigation that I think is really important to highlight. So first, let's just do this recap of the React Router package. And then I'm going to hone in on a very particular thing that I did in the programmatic navigation that's going to introduce a topic that's really important for y'all to understand with regards to React and React features and stuff in general. So we talked about package JSON, talked about all this stuff. So y'all should probably be good here. Y'all know that the source folder is where typically all of our React code is housed. Inside of there, I typically create a components directory that holds all my components. And so this is a project I've been working on for a while. I've made like a bunch of random projects that are kind of in this one master project. So all of the stuff underneath this components folder isn't really necessary. But for the purpose of what we're talking about, I have a folder called routing that has a couple of components here. So that dashboard component, which is just returning dashboard right now, right? That home component and that login component are all kind of just simple functional components that are defined inside of this routing directory. So just want to point that out. We'll talk about those files a little bit more specifically in a second. So to just give a quick recap of how the React router package works and how you have to set it up. First step is you have to install it. So that means you need to go into whatever project, React project, you're trying to add that React router to. Make sure you're inside of that project folder, right? So do whatever you got to do to make sure that you are inside of the project folder that you want to be in. You should be inside and see like your package.json, see your node module, see all of the stuff that you would normally expect to see. Inside of there, that's when you would want to do the NPM install react-router-dom. So the full package name isn't React Router. There is another package called React Router that already got installed from React with the Create React App toolchain. We want to install React Router DOM. It's a completely different package that does completely different stuff. So just make sure that when you're installing it, you're installing the right package. Otherwise, everything we're talking about isn't going to work. After you've installed React Router DOM, right? It'll take its time. It'll install the packages, and then it will allow you to start leveraging that package inside of your code base. I've already installed it, so I'm not tripping about it. I think it'll just tell me that it's there. Okay. So after you've installed React Router DOM, the next thing you need to do, the like literal next thing you need to do is wrap your application with the React Router DOM browser router. The browser router is a component that is a, essentially it's a wrapper for your entire application that sits on top of the application. It sits on top of our app.js basically, and is a component that like kind of gives the app.js a lot of, it passes information that the app.js can use while it's rendering. The browser router is one of the most, is the component responsible for facilitating a lot of the routing from the React router package. So you need to have this browser router wrapping your application. Otherwise, it's not going to pass the navigation routing information as you would expect it to. Just adding this component doesn't change anything stylistically to the app. It doesn't do anything visual. It really is passing data into this app.js. And that's kind of why it's important to wrap it. So the two ways you can wrap it is either go into, if you're using a Create React App toolchain, that is, right? This is a little different if you're using a different toolchain. But I'm assuming if you're kind of following along with me, you're using Create React App, and you're kind of getting started with developing applications in React for the first time, or maybe like, independently kind of for yourself. So the two ways to do this are inside of the index.js. You can either wrap your app component with the browser router like so. So first you have to import browser router from React Router DOM, and then you can use it like a component, basically as an element, and nest your app within it. So we don't really see many examples of like a nested component like this, where it kind of has that HTML-like structure where we have a component that opens it, where we have an element that's like an open element, then we have this closing element, right? We don't typically see this structure OD in the React component breakdown. Typically, we see components self-close like this app component. There are components that do take in components as children like this in a nested format. The browser router is one. And in doing it like this, it knows the app.js is its child component, and then it knows to pass information, how it can pass information to the app.js. So this is one way to create the browser router to be set up the right way. The other way that you'll see, just based on like developer preference, really, is somebody else importing the browser router into the app.js itself, and then wrapping the code that would have been in the app.js with that browser router. So same kind of thing. but the difference being that in this sense, the browser router is defined inside of the app.js versus outside in the index.js. There's no way that's better than others. Personally, I think that I personally use the index.js way more. But I think I use the app.js route way just as frequently. So there's no like wrong way to do it, but the only wrong way to do it is not doing it. So make sure you wrap your app with the browser router somehow. And so yeah, that's step 2. First step, install React Router DOM package. Second step, import the browser router and wrap your app somehow with the browser router. Then the third step is to define your routes. So this is part of the change in V5 and V6 of the React Router API. You can't, so typically we use what was called a switch statement to, it was like a component called switch that actually did this for us, but that switch component got renamed to routes. So we use this routes component to hold essentially all of the routes that are available to the application. So you have to define this routes component based on all of the routes that are possible for the platform to navigate to. If you want the React router to know that it can navigate to a specific thing, you have to lay it out. And just like the browser router, this does nothing visually for your component. It doesn't change anything visually at all. This is just data that the component now knows it has access to as well. So the routes component is kind of like this nested container that has route, like singular components inside of it. Each singular route component has a path that is kind of like the URL path that it would follow, and then the element that will show up when you navigate to that particular path, right? So here's where I have all of those things defined: the path for the login page, the path for the dashboard, the path for the just regular home. So remember that in web dev stuff, just a single slash like this typically is used to represent like the index or the home page, right? So if the browser knows that if you don't input anything, put a slash at the end, that you're going to that same route with the slash at the end. So that's why I use that as the home. Yeah, and so that's as simple as all it takes. So that's the next step, is like to have these routes defined with the path and the element that you want to return from that route. The next step is, if you want, and this is now an optional step. So those are all the mandatory steps to then get React Router working in your application. The next step, like I said, is kind of optional. You can create links, right? Which are just like they sound, the clickable kind of links that you can click that are able to then navigate to specific paths based on whatever the path you set that link to go to is. So links are nested elements, so you can actually have the link be whatever you want it to be. So here I have this link wrapping some text, right? But I could also have this link wrapping another button or something, and that button say home or something like that, right? So in doing that, right, we're gonna just see a quick little change happen here, where now this is a button, right? And that button still links to, the button still kind of links to this page, right? I could go to the login page, go to the home page. So the link element itself is just the thing that creates the ability for you to link. You can put whatever it is you want in there. It could be a button, it could be an image, it could just be text. So just wanted to make that point. And then, so again, like that's an optional step. And that's kind of how this whole thing was working. We defined those routes, had those links. At first I had a link for the dashboard, but then I wanted to make this app a little bit more sophisticated. And so I'll show you how I did that with regards to those particular components we talked about before. So home component, pretty simple, right? Super functional component, just returning this like heading. The logging component is, or the dashboard component, I'll just start there. It's also very simple. Dashboard component just shows dashboard, right? Nothing too crazy there. The component that's a little more complicated is the is the login component, because it, one, has a form inside of there that is collecting some information. Not too, I didn't really do anything with the form information. Like, you know, it was kind of there as like a placeholder, dummy kind of form. But you can imagine that I can build this form out just like we did in our other, some of the other projects we built out, to be a little bit more specific with collecting the data it needs to collect and then doing something with that data, like validating it or sending it to a server to authenticate, all types of stuff. But for the purpose of the example, all this form is doing is just presenting itself, letting users type in it. And then when the submit button gets clicked, right, it triggers this forms on submit function, which that forms on submit function does a programmatic navigation. Programmatic navigation is a feature of React Router, right? We can navigate programmatically. And navigating programmatically basically means instead of navigating by clicking the links and using the linked component, we can navigate based on an event happening. We can trigger a navigation. We could tell the page, hey, I want you to navigate now. So that's a very important thing to be able to do, right? Because there'll probably be moments where you just want your application to navigate, and you need to have some type of system and setup for telling it to navigate on its own. And here's where things get a little interesting. And I told y'all last time when I did this that I was going to bring it back up. And so here I am, man of my word, bringing it back up. So the navigate programmatically leverages a specific function created by React Router DOM called use navigate. And use navigate is a function that is use navigate is a function that is defined by the React Router DOM library that creates an object called navigate that then is like kind of a function in and of itself. This function allows you to define a specific path that you want to go to, you want to take the user to, and that path then like by calling this navigate object, or this navigate function, I should say, you can go directly to that particular path. And so remember that route is defined already here. Dashboard I called this dashboard with a lowercase d, but clearly dashboard with a capital D still goes to the same thing. Just for the sake of making it consistent, I do want this to be consistent. So even though it's still working, because it's matching the string. So that kind of goes and makes the point that you want to make sure that you're not giving your routes things that are too similar, because it might match that string in and of itself. But so the use navigate function created this opportunity for us to then navigate directly into our dashboard. And that's all it really is doing. Nothing too crazy there. If I were to like go, so you can always look at some of the code that comes back from the inside of the React packages. So, and VS Code makes it super simple. If you hover over anything, and I think on Windows, if you hold Control and then it gives you this option to click it. On a Mac, if you hold Command and you hover over this, it'll give you an option to click it. That'll let you see. That'll let you see some of the code that thing was defined in. And so clearly, the use navigate is a function that was defined by React Router that allows you to return the element for the child route, blah, 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 blah. Right. So, or no, just kidding. This is the comments here. This use navigate is an imperative function for changing the location. Links use this, but also it could be used by other elements. So the link component actually uses this navigate function, but we can also just make use of it on our own. So cool. So that's just kind of a recap of this particular kind of this particular component and how that component works in and of itself. And so this is how the React router library works, and how we can use it for navigating, and how we can use it for getting kind of acclimated with like adding those routing that routing behavior into our application as a whole. And yeah, we use the React router pretty often. It's a pretty important package to get familiar with. So like I said before, I highly recommend that y'all go through the tutorial on your own and just just follow along. It kind of does this. The tutorial itself is pretty long, but it'll show you in a very practical project oriented way all of the things you can do programmatically with the React router, and help you build out a little kind of, semi sophisticated project for doing so.